We would like to send out a special thanks to Native for supporting The Trail Went Cold. Native makes safe, simple, effective products that people use in the bathroom every day with trusted ingredients and trusted performance. For 20% off your first purchase, please visit nativedeodorant.com and enter the promo code COLD during checkout. That's nativedeodorant.com and the promo code is COLD. Thank you and enjoy the show. September 11th, 2001. Tioga County, New York. 35-year-old Michele Harris finishes her evening shift at her workplace, but never returns home. The following morning, Michele's abandoned minivan is discovered on a road next to the driveway of her family's rural property, and tiny specks of blood are soon found inside the residence. Suspicion turns towards Michele's estranged husband, Cal Harris, as the couple are in the midst of a heated divorce. Years later, Cal is charged with Michele's murder, but after 4 trials and 2 overturned convictions, Cal is acquitted of the crime in 2016, and no trace of Michele is ever found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and we've got a pretty convoluted case to cover today. The 2001 disappearance of Michele Harris. Now, as you might have noticed, the release date for this episode is September the 11th, and the main reason I decided to cover this case today is because it happened to take place on September the 11th, 2001, only about 200 miles away from New York City. On this particular date, while the world's attention was focused elsewhere, a wife and mother named Michele Harris vanished without a trace, and it wasn't long before her husband, Cal Harris, became the prime suspect. And this was just the beginning of a lengthy saga which would contain a number of twists and turns over the next 15 years. Even though Michele's body was never found, Cal would be charged with her murder, and while he was found guilty the first time around, Cal ultimately wound up going on trial no less than 4 times before he was acquitted for good. But of course, just because you're found not guilty in a court of law does not necessarily mean you're innocent of the crime, but the most controversial aspect of this case is that even though there are a number of reasons to be suspicious of Cal, there's very little actual evidence to prove he murdered his wife. For their part, Cal and his defense team have always pointed the fingers at alternate suspects, but even after all this legal wrangling, Michele is still a missing person after all these years, so we're going to try and figure out the most likely explanation for what happened to her on today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the disappearance of Michele Harris. Our story begins in Tioga County, New York in 2001. Our central figure is 35-year-old Michele Harris, who has been married to her 40-year-old husband, Cal Harris, for the past 11 years. Michele and Cal have 2 sons, Taylor and Tanner, and 2 daughters, Kayla and Jenna, who are all under the age of 7. The family lives on a rural 252-acre estate located on Hagador Hill Road, just outside the small town of Spencer. Cal hails from a wealthy, influential family, as his father owned 6 car dealerships throughout the area, which are currently being run by Cal and his 2 brothers. In fact, Michele was working as a secretary at one of these dealerships when she and Cal originally met. Unfortunately, by this point, the Harris' marriage has completely fallen apart, as Michele officially filed for divorce from Cal in January of 2001. She has accused her husband of being controlling and having a temper, and claimed that Cal also conducted an affair with a clerk from one of his dealerships while she was pregnant with her 4th child. However, Cal is very opposed to the divorce and did not react well when Michele informed him about it. In fact, when Michele's sister-in-law phoned her at their house that night, she could hear Cal screaming at Michele in the background while she begged him not to come near her. Following the call, Michele attempted to flee the house, while Cal used his truck to block her car in the garage. Michele still managed to get away and retreated to her brother and sister-in-law's home, and the incident caused enough concern that she filed an order of protection against Cal. In spite of their heated relationship, the court ordered the couple to continue sharing the same house with their children until the divorce was officially finalized. Michele agreed to the arrangement because of the ongoing custody battle over the children, as she feared Cal might try and claim abandonment if she decided to move out. However, the order of protection prevented Cal from inflicting any physical or mental abuse on Michele while they continued living together, and Michele also took the extra step of removing all guns from the house. Throughout the course of the year, both sides have been unable to come to a financial arrangement in their divorce proceedings, as Michele turned down a $740,000 settlement, which would have involved Cal paying her $200,000 immediately and $54,000 per year paid over the course of the next decade. Since Cal had a reported net worth of $5.4 million, Michele demanded a full accounting of his businesses. In August, she filed legal paperwork seeking an appraisal of the Harris family's dealerships, which involved a $30,000 appraisal fee that would be charged to Cal. If a settlement could not be reached, the couple would go to court for a divorce trial in October. In the meantime, since Cal had cut off her weekly allowance, Michele took a job as a waitress at Lefty's, a restaurant bar located in the nearby town of Waverly. On the evening of September 11th, Michele showed up to work her shift at Lefty's. When her shift ended, she stuck around to have a drink at the bar with 2 of her fellow co-workers before leaving at approximately 9:30 p.m. The following morning, Cal woke up at around 7 a.m. and was surprised to discover that Michele was not home. Since Cal needed help getting the kids ready for school, he called up the family's nanny, Barb Thayer, and asked her to come over. Barb subsequently drove to the Harris residence, but when she arrived, she was surprised to discover Michele's gold 2000 Ford Windstar minivan parked on the side of Hagedorn Hill Road. It was located right next to the entrance to the Harris family property, a driveway which was 1/4 mile long. The keys were still in the van's ignition, and there didn't seem to be any signs of damage or foul play, but Michele herself was nowhere to be found. Barb immediately went to the house and summoned Cal to come down and take a look at the minivan. To Barb's surprise, Cal did not seem to show much concern. In fact, he claimed that Michele had made plans to travel to New York City to visit a former university classmate of hers on September the 13th or 14th. He figured that Michele had already left on her 200-mile trip and decided to leave her minivan behind because she hitched a ride there. Cal also said that the minivan looked like it was a mess and asked Barb to drop it off at the dealership later that day so they could clean it. Barb found it odd that Cal asked her to do this since she had not yet revealed to him that the keys were still in the ignition. Cal then left for work while Barb prepped the kids for school. Barb claimed that she made a call to Michele's cell phone from the house phone and got no answer, but became concerned enough to contact one of Michele's friends to inform her that Michele was missing. This friend subsequently contacted Michele's divorce attorney, who had a scheduled appointment with Michele later that afternoon, and he quickly contacted the New York State Police to report Michele missing. Investigators soon showed up at Cal's dealership in order to question him about Michele's disappearance. He was very cooperative and happily escorted the investigators back to his residence so they could perform a search. Cal even went so far as to grant them full consent to search the house without him being present, and subsequently returned to work. Over the course of the next several days, extensive searches would be performed of the Harris' 252-acre property, which included a private lake. However, by their own admission, the state police's initial search for Michele was nowhere near as extensive as they would have liked, since they had already sent between 500 and 600 troopers to New York City to help deal with the aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And for this very reason, none of Michele's friends or family believed Cal's story that she had hitched a ride to New York to visit a friend. Not only was it very uncharacteristic for Michele to take off and leave her children behind without telling anyone, but it seemed very unlikely that she would have been inclined to travel to New York in the wake of such a major tragedy, particularly since access to the city was very restricted at that point. But according to Cal, the main reason Michele was making that trip was because she had been planning to pawn off some of her jewelry, including a Rolex watch and diamond engagement ring. Cal claimed that Michele always carried this jewelry in a velvet bag, but both this bag and her purse were missing from the minivan. Even though Cal was still responsible for covering all the household expenses, he said that Michele was experiencing financial problems at the time, as she had rung up $16,000 in credit card debt, and he suspected she was abusing drugs and alcohol. Well, of course, Michele's family and friends did not believe these allegations, and immediately suspected that Cal was involved in her disappearance. More alarm bells were raised when a forensic specialist with the New York State Police did a search of the Harris residence on September the 14th, and discovered what appeared to be tiny specks of blood. They were located on the tiled floor of a kitchen alcove, a throw rug, door moldings leading from the kitchen to the garage, as well as the garage floor and the garage wall. DNA testing would later determine that the blood matched Michele or one of her biological relatives, but it wasn't a large enough quantity to conclusively determine that foul play had taken place. While Cal claimed to have no idea where the blood came from, he did say he recalled a previous incident where one of his sons cut their finger and left a few drops of blood in the garage. But as much suspicion as there was about Cal, it would turn out there were other potential suspects in Michele's disappearance. While Cal's fingerprints were found on the driver's side door, which wasn't unusual, a second set of prints on the door wound up matching a 23-year-old man named Brian Early. A search of Michele's cell phone records also showed that Brian called her from his apartment in the hamlet of Smithborough on the evening of September 11th. It turned out that Brian had been romantically involved with Michele for nearly a year. He originally hailed from Philadelphia, but met Michele at a bar while frequenting the area in the fall of 2000. It wasn't long before they began an affair, and the couple often sneaked away for romantic rendezvous together. Brian even went so far as to make a permanent move to Tioga County to be closer to Michele, and he hoped to marry her once her divorce from Cal was finalized. In fact, Brian also gave Michele money to make half of a $10,000 down payment on a new house for herself. Following her shift at Lefty's on September the 11th, Michele traveled to Brian's apartment in Smithborough to see him. The apartment was located approximately 20 minutes away from Michele's residence, and according to Brian, she left sometime between 11 and 11:30 p.m. to drive home, which technically made him the last known person to have seen her alive. Brian also claimed that as Michele was leaving, he leaned in through the driver's side window to kiss her, which would have explained how his fingerprints wound up on the door. But even though Brian was in love with Michele and wanted to settle down with her, Michele's friends did not believe she was ready to get married again so soon after her divorce. And it turned out that Brian was not the only man Michele had been seeing. From April until June of 2001, Michele carried on an affair with Michael Casper, one of her managers at Lefty's. This affair was so secretive that not even Michele's best friend knew about it, but Casper claimed that he and Michele had mutually agreed to end their affair and there was no animosity over it. I previously mentioned that Michele had stopped to have a drink with two of her co-workers at Lefty's after her final shift ended. Well, one of them was Michael Casper, and the other was a cook named Michael Hakes. But it turned out that Hakes had previously served 10 years in an Arizona prison for rape. Hakes had only been released 1 year beforehand, and apparently, none of his co-workers, including Michele, was aware of his criminal history. Both Casper and Hakes claim they last saw Michele when she left the bar at around 9:30 p.m., presumably to drive to Brian's apartment. Hakes also seemed to have a pretty strong alibi, as his girlfriend claimed that he arrived at her apartment shortly thereafter and spent the night. In the end, Hakes, Casper, and Brian Early all fully cooperated with the investigation and passed polygraph tests, and there was no evidence to implicate any of them in Michele's disappearance. Of course, the brunt of the suspicion continued to be directed towards Cal, and there were a number of other things about him which raised red flags. Even though Cal was known for having a temper, many people believed he appeared uncharacteristically calm and nonchalant after Michele turned up missing. Because of his controlling personality, Cal was known to frequently call Michele on her cell phone to check on her whenever she stayed out late. But even though Michele did not turn up this time, there was no record of Cal ever having made any calls to her cell phone on September the 12th or after. I previously mentioned how after the discovery of Michele's minivan, Cal asked Barb Thayer to drive it to his dealership so he could give it a thorough cleaning. While Cal reportedly had his own truck washed at the dealership on that very same day. Only 1 week after Michele disappeared, Cal asked Barb to start selling Michele's belongings at a garage sale and told Barb he would split the money with her. If that wasn't enough, Cal almost immediately started a new relationship with a former girlfriend of his. On September the 29th, which happened to be Michele's birthday, Cal brought this woman to his house to spend the night. When she expressed concern that Michele could potentially return and find her there, Cal allegedly replied, quote, "Don't worry, she's not coming home." Barb Thayer continued to work as a nanny for the Harris children in the year following Michele's disappearance, but claimed that Cal never once asked her if she had heard anything about Michele and never made any attempt to keep in touch with Michele's family. These concerns prompted the police to get a warrant to install a tracking device on Cal's truck in order to monitor his movements. They tracked him for 6 months, hoping that he might eventually lead them to the location of Michele's body, but this never occurred. In spite of their lack of success at finding Michele, investigators would spend the next few years gradually building a case against Cal. Finally, on September the 30th, 2005, the Tioga County grand jury would indict Cal on 1 count of second-degree murder. He was subsequently arrested and released on a $500,000 bail. However, there would be extensive delays until Cal's trial actually began. In December of 2006, a Tioga County judge would be asked to recuse himself from the case for what the district attorney alleged was favoritism towards Cal and his defense attorney. As a result, Broome County Judge Martin Smith would be appointed to preside over the case instead, and the trial finally began in May of 2007. The core of the prosecution's case would be the tiny specks of blood found in the kitchen and garage of the Harris family residence. They argued that when Michele returned home on the evening of September 11th, or the early morning hours of September 12th, Cal beat her to death with a blunt object in that section of the house before disposing of her body and the murder weapon. He may have used Michele's minivan to transport the body before abandoning it on Hagedorn Hill Road next to the driveway. Of course, the case against Cal was very circumstantial, but the prosecution believed that the specks of blood were strong enough physical evidence that foul play had taken place. To support this, they brought in famous forensic scientist Henry Lee, who testified that the pattern of the blood spots indicated that they were, quote-unquote, medium-velocity blood spatter caused by Michele being struck with 2 blows from a blunt instrument. When photographs of the blood specks were shown to Lee, he described them as, quote-unquote, vivid red, and believed they were only 2 or 3 days old when the photos were originally taken on September the 14th, 2001. Lee also believed that the blood found on the throw rug was a 1-inch transfer stain from a bloody object containing the victim's DNA being placed on the rug. Indeed, Barb Thayer would also testify that it was her routine to launder the rug at least twice per month, lending credence to the idea that the blood was recent. The prosecution would also present a history of violent, threatening behavior on Cal's part to support their case for murder. Michele's sister-in-law recounted the incident where she phoned the Harris residence shortly after Michele informed Cal about her intention to divorce him, prompting Cal to scream at her in the background. In addition, there was testimony from two of Michele's sisters-in-law that in the months prior to her disappearance, Michele had told them that Cal once threatened her and said, quote, "I don't even need a gun. I got the perfect place to put your body. They'll never find you," end quote. Michele's former hairdresser would also testify that in July of 2001, Michele let him listen in on a phone call she had with Cal at a salon. The hairdresser claimed he heard Cal demanding Michele to drop the divorce proceedings, telling her, quote, "I will fucking kill you. I can make you disappear," end quote. Well, even though there was no body or murder weapon, and very little in the way of physical evidence, the jury believed the prosecution's version of events. On June 7th, they found Cal guilty of second-degree murder, but before a sentencing could be passed, there would be a very unexpected development. The day after the verdict, a Tioga County farmer named Kevin Tubbs read about the case in the newspaper and came forward to share a surprising story with Cal's defense team. According to Tubbs, at approximately 5:30 a.m., he was hauling a load of hay down Hagedorn Hill Road on the morning of September the 12th, 2001, when he passed by the entrance to the Harris family property. He claimed that Michele's minivan was parked by the side of the road, but also said he saw a blonde woman matching Michele's description arguing with a man at the end of the driveway who was standing next to a dark-colored Chevrolet pickup truck. Tubbs described this man as being in his mid-20s and was absolutely certain it was not Cal Harris. While Cal's defense team believed this story totally destroyed the prosecution's case because if Michele was still alive at 5:30 a.m., it seemed very unlikely that Cal would have had enough time to kill her, dispose of her body, and clean up the evidence before he phoned up Barb Thayer at around 7 o'clock that morning. If that wasn't enough, the defense had also uncovered another potential suspect who seemed to match the description of the man in the driveway. He was a 25-year-old steelworker named Stacy Stewart, who originally hailed from Texas, but was living in Tioga County in 2001. Stewart was a regular patron at Lefty's and was reportedly acquainted with Michele. He drove a dark-colored pickup truck around that time period, and he lived in a house only 7 miles from the Harris residence. Stewart had purchased the house only a month before Michele went missing, and he wound up returning to Texas in early 2002 without making a single mortgage payment on the house. But in spite of this new revelation, the district attorney's office had major issues with Tubbs' story. They were very suspicious of the fact that Tubbs waited nearly 6 years to come forward with this information. They discovered that Tubbs had once filed a lawsuit against the state police for using excessive force while unlawfully arresting him at a gas station, but the suit was ultimately dismissed. So perhaps Tubbs was intentionally trying to undermine the case against Cal Harris because of a personal grudge against law enforcement. Even if Tubbs was telling the truth, the district attorney's office was very skeptical about his ability to accurately remember this incident after so many years and be certain that it took place on the morning of September the 12th. But after considering the new evidence, Judge Martin Smith found Tubbs' story to be credible, so he decided to overturn Cal's conviction. Cal was released on bail and granted a new trial, which would take place in July of 2009. The defense team soon received another eyewitness statement from a man named John Steele. Like Tubbs, Steele claimed he had been driving down Hagedorn Hill Road at around 6 a.m. on the morning of September the 12th and saw a truck parked at the end of the driveway of the Harris property. He thought he overheard a male voice saying, "Get in the car, just get in the damn car," while he passed by. Steele shared this story in a sworn affidavit, but he passed away before Cal's second trial began. As a result, his statement would not be admissible as evidence under any recognized hearsay exception. Kevin Tubbs would be allowed to testify at the trial, but in spite of this, the jury still believed the prosecution's scenario that Cal killed Michele. For the second time, Cal was found guilty of second-degree murder, and this time, he received a sentence of 25 years to life in prison. But this would not be the end of this story. In October of 2012, Cal's conviction would be overturned by the New York Court of Appeals on the basis of two procedural errors. During jury selection, one prospective juror acknowledged that she had followed the case and had her own pre-existing opinion about the defendant's guilt or innocence, but assured everyone that she could remain impartial and reach a verdict based solely on the evidence. In spite of the defense's objections, this woman managed to get a spot on the jury, but the Court of Appeals believed this should not have happened. In addition, they also agreed with the defense's assertion that the jury had been given insufficient instructions regarding hearsay testimony being allowed during the trial, particularly in regards to the statements Michele had allegedly made to her sisters-in-law in the months prior to her disappearance. Cal's conviction would be overturned for the second time, and he was released from prison on bail until his third trial could take place in May of 2015. Due to the immense publicity surrounding the case in Tioga County, the trial would now take place over 2 hours away in Schoharie County. This time around, the defense's case involved refuting allegations that Cal never attempted to call Michele's cell phone when he discovered she was missing. Phone records showed that a call was made from the Harris residence to Michele's cell at 7:13 a.m. on the morning of September the 12th, but while Barb Thayer claimed to have made the call and received no answer, the defense claimed that it was Cal. As you recall, Cal had phoned Barb at around 7 a.m., asking her to come over to help the kids get ready for school, and his defense team argued that Barb would not have had enough time to drive there and make the call at 7:13. They said that Cal was the one who actually called Michele's cell, and if he was truly guilty, he would have left a voicemail to create an alibi for himself. The defense was also hoping to put more focus on an alternate suspect, Stacy Stewart, whom they believed was the man Kevin Tubbs saw arguing with Michele in the driveway. They brought in various witnesses to testify about incriminating statements Stewart allegedly made, but Schoharie County Judge George Bartlett ruled that their testimony was hearsay and would not allow the jury to hear it. At one point, this prompted Cal to have an outburst in which he accused Judge Bartlett of continuously siding with the prosecution before storming out of the courtroom. The case wound up in the hands of the jury, who would go on to deliberate for 11 days. In the end, they failed to reach a verdict and told the judge they were hopelessly deadlocked, so a mistrial was declared. So Cal would go on trial for the fourth time in May of 2016, but this time, he decided to waive his right to a trial by jury. Instead, he asked for a bench trial, so the verdict would be in the hands of State Supreme Court Judge Richard Mott, who allowed the defense to introduce new evidence which had not been admissible at the previous trials. Judge Mott gave them permission to present an argument for third-party culpability and point the finger at alternate suspects. In January of that year, the defense organized an excavation of a burn pit on a piece of property which had belonged to Stacy Stewart at the time Michele went missing. They wound up unearthing several items, including a bra strap, charred clothing fabric which matched the color of Michele's waitressing uniform from Lefty's, some buttons, and a latch and a clasp from a woman's handbag. In addition to Stacy Stewart, the defense also intended to implicate a friend of his named Christopher Thomason. Like Stewart, Thomason was a steelworker from Texas and had been a frequent patron at Lefty's while Michele was working there. During the early stages of the investigation, Stewart and Thomason had both been cleared by police after being interviewed and passing polygraph tests, but the defense would call upon numerous witnesses to testify about incriminating statements both men had allegedly made. A former girlfriend of Thomason's claimed that in 2011, he told her that the reason he and Stewart moved back to Texas from New York was because police had been questioning them about a murder case. Thomason allegedly said that on the morning of September the 12th, 2001, both he and his girlfriend at that time went over to Stewart's property and asked him to burn their clothing because he had gotten blood on them from killing a deer. Thomason then told the witness that he wasn't worried about any of this stuff coming up again because Cal Harris had been found guilty of his wife's murder. In addition, Thomason's estranged wife testified that her husband had once brought up Michele's case completely out of the blue and remarked that Stacy Stewart had, quote-unquote, probably buried her in concrete. More testimony was provided by Stewart's ex-girlfriend, who claimed that after a night of drinking, Stewart once told her that he was the last person to have seen Michele Harris alive, and that he, quote-unquote, knew how to hide a body. However, Judge Mott ultimately ruled that all of the defense's evidence, which pointed to Stewart and Thomason, including the charred items found in the burn pit, were inadmissible, so he tossed all the evidence out of the trial record. Nevertheless, after hearing both sides from the prosecution and the defense, Judge Mott spent 12 hours deliberating before reaching a verdict. In the end, he just did not believe there was enough evidence to prove Cal's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, so on May the 24th, he officially found Cal not guilty of second-degree murder. Due to double jeopardy, this meant that Cal could never be tried for Michele's murder again. Following the verdict, Cal stated, quote, "There are no winners in this case. Not until we find the mother of my children, we won't get closure," end quote. Cal continued living with his 4 children, who had always stood by him, and publicly stated that their father was completely innocent of their mother's disappearance. However, the acquittal would not spell the end for Cal's legal troubles. In March of 2015, while awaiting his 3rd trial, Cal had a confrontation outside a Tioga County government office building with a man named Thomas Zukuski. Cal's daughter Kayla had been attending a community college class there, and during one of the classes, Zukuski started a discussion about Cal's upcoming trial. He had been unaware that Cal's daughter was in the class, and since the discussion upset Kayla, Cal decided to confront Zukuski, and they had a heated exchange in which he shouted profanities and allegedly threatened him. Well, since Zukuski just happened to be the brother of the police chief of the town of Binghamton, this landed Cal in hot water, as he was charged with second-degree harassment, and Zukuski took out an order of protection against him. In August of 2016, Cal was found guilty of the crime, and in exchange for a conditional discharge, Cal was ordered to pay $225 in fines and take anger management counseling. But that's not all. In June of 2016, less than 3 weeks after his acquittal, Cal was charged with the misdemeanor of 4th-degree stalking after showing up outside the house of a state trooper who had worked on the investigation against him and testified as a witness for the prosecution at Cal's 4th trial. Cal allegedly remained there for over an hour and stated, quote, "I'm going to get you guys. How's your son? Maybe I will go drag him out of school. I have been following him around," end quote. Once again, an order of protection was filed against Cal, though I have been unable to find out how the case against him ultimately turned out. And there's still more. In December of 2017, Cal was arrested again after hitting a car with his pickup truck on the interstate and fleeing the scene. He was found to be driving with a blood alcohol level of 0.13 and charged with DUI and leaving the scene of an accident. The following August, Cal pled guilty to the offenses in exchange for a $500 fine and having his license suspended for 90 days. Anyway, immediately following his acquittal, Cal had announced that his legal team was filing a civil suit against the Tioga County District Attorney's Office and the New York State Police for misconduct. He claimed that the lead investigator on the case, Sue Mulvey, had a major conflict of interest and attempted to railroad him because he had previously fired Mulvey's father from one of his dealerships. At the time of this episode's release, Cal's civil suit is still pending, but only a few weeks before this was recorded, a U.S. District Court judge ordered Tioga County officials to respond. But throughout all this, one issue from this case which has never been resolved are the whereabouts of Michele Harris. After 18 years, Michele's body has still not been found, and the actual circumstances of her disappearance remain unknown. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Native, as we are thrilled that they are supporting The Trail Went Cold. Native is a deodorant which can hang with you in any situation, whether it be your workout, your busy mom life, a 16-hour day, or even recording this podcast in a hot room in the middle of summer with the air conditioning turned off. Native makes safe, simple, effective products that people use in the bathroom every day with trusted ingredients and trusted performance. In fact, it has fewer, simpler ingredients, so you know everything that's in the deodorant. Native comes in a wide variety of enticing scents for both men and women, and they also release new limited edition seasonal scents throughout the year. But they also have many classic deodorant scents, such as coconut and vanilla, which is their most popular scent, lavender and rose, eucalyptus and mint, and cucumber and mint, which is the brand I personally ordered. Native also offers free returns and exchanges in the USA, and if you subscribe to them, you can save 17% and $2 per stick, and it will be conveniently delivered to your door every 1, 2, 3, or 4 months. For the past several weeks, I have been using the cucumber and mint brand, which served me well during this hot and sticky summer, and it's quite a terrific scent. When you're making a podcast about scary stories which can cause you to break out into a sweat, it helps to be as cool as a cucumber. It's reassuring to know that Native is made with clean ingredients which will not harm your body and are guaranteed for maximum effectiveness. But Native also does offer an unscented formula and baking soda-free formula for those with sensitivities. So in order to get 20% off your first purchase of Native, please visit nativedeodorant.com and enter the promo code COLD during checkout. Once again, that's 20% off your first purchase by going to nativedeodorant.com and entering the promo code COLD. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the episode. So to describe this case as a crazy up-and-down roller coaster ride would be an understatement, to say the least. I first learned about this case when it was featured on an episode of 48 Hours, and on the surface, it seemed like one of their many episodes which had the most obvious solution to the mystery. The husband did it. They produced their initial episode in 2010, following Cal Harris's conviction after his second trial, but then they had to keep releasing new and updated versions of the episode because Cal ended up going on trial 2 more times. Their last version was titled The Final Verdict and concluded with Cal's acquittal. It's also interesting to go back and see that this case was featured on an episode of Forensic Files several years ago, which outlined how the authorities were able to use these tiny specks of blood to secure a murder conviction without the victim's body. It's very rare for The Trail Went Cold to cover a case from Forensic Files, since the whole concept of that show is showcasing how the cases were solved. So it's fascinating to watch their Michele Harris episode and know that the case wound up becoming unsolved again, since the evidence wasn't as rock solid as they originally thought. Now, I'm sure that many of you do not consider this to be a wrongful conviction story, and believe that in spite of his acquittal, Cal Harris is still guilty of this crime and got away with murder. That is certainly possible, but what makes this case unique is that Cal was acquitted at a bench trial by a state Supreme Court judge, which is drastically different than being acquitted by a jury. It's usually a huge gamble to ask for a bench trial, because if you're found guilty, it's really difficult to overturn a judge's verdict. However, after 2 convictions and a 3rd trial with a hung jury, I can see why Cal's defense team would have elected to go in that direction. And I have to say that regardless of whether Cal was innocent or guilty, I really can't disagree with Judge Richard Mott's ruling. Remember, his job was not to determine if Cal was innocent, he just had to look at all the evidence and determine whether or not it was strong enough to find Cal guilty of second-degree murder beyond a reasonable doubt. In this particular case, we had no body, and the only physical evidence was some tiny specks of blood, which did not conclusively prove that foul play had taken place. Now, the prosecution did paint a very unflattering picture of Cal, as he was portrayed as a controlling, hot-tempered husband who sounded like he was capable of committing murder, but the actual evidence of murder was just not there. It's possible that the 2 juries who found Cal guilty reached their verdicts based on emotions and a personal dislike for him, which is not what an objective trial judge is supposed to do. It's also worth noting that Judge Mott disallowed all the defense's evidence which pointed to alternate suspects and still reached a not guilty verdict, which should give you an idea of just how weak the prosecution's case really was. Now, I will say that if Cal Harris were to go on trial for being an unlikable person, I would have no trouble finding him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Regardless of whether or not he killed Michele, I have no trouble believing the allegations that Cal was a controlling husband and had a hot temper. Cal's other legal troubles really say a lot about his character, as he got charged with second-degree harassment for starting a heated confrontation with a guy in between his second and third trials, and he also allegedly stalked a state trooper and threatened his family less than 3 weeks after he was acquitted, which is just insane to me. It's funny how when he walked out of the courtroom, Cal made a statement to the media about how finding the mother of his children was his top priority, yet it seemed like his top priority was actually getting revenge on the people who wronged him. When this case was featured on the true crime show, Crime Watch Daily, Cal was interviewed and pretty much confirmed that a lot of the harassment claims which have been made against him are true, and that he has a tendency to go on social media and get into arguments with people about this case. However, it must be said that Cal's 4 children have never stopped supporting him, stating in interviews that they have zero doubt that he's innocent, and sadly, it sounds like they are now completely estranged from Michele's side of the family. I definitely have nothing but the utmost sympathy for them, as they had to go through a non-stop 15-year ordeal in which they lost their mother, and witnessed their father get accused of murdering her, during which time he went on trial and went in and out of prison multiple times. Given that these kids were still very young when Michele disappeared, and have been raised by their father and his side of the family, I can see why they would have a hard time accepting he might be guilty, and I certainly won't criticize them for it. At the very least, I hope that Cal has treated his kids a lot better than he treated their mother. Anyway, in a lot of these missing spouse cases in which the husband is the prime suspect, it's so easy to assume they're guilty because there's no other scenario involving alternate suspects which makes any sense. But this case is a bit different because in the years since Michele's disappearance, no less than 5 men besides Cal have been looked at as potential alternate suspects. I mean, we know she was involved in affairs with at least 2 other men and saw them both on the night she went missing, and if that wasn't enough, it turns out she also had drinks with a convicted rapist that night as well. It sounds like Lefties, the establishment where Michele worked, was a place that attracted rough characters, including 2 men whom Cal's defense team has accused of being the real perpetrators in recent years. Obviously, since Cal and Michele had spent several months going through a heated divorce, Cal had a stronger motive than any of these men to commit murder, and he also had the means and opportunity. But we do have a window of between 7 and 8 hours in which Michele's whereabouts are unaccounted for, so it's not completely implausible that one or more of these suspects could have killed her before Cal woke up and discovered she was missing. So let's go back to the very beginning and explore how these series of events unfolded. The theory presented by the prosecution at each of Cal's trials is that he killed Michele shortly after she arrived home, either late on the evening of September 11th or the early morning hours of September 12th. They believe he struck her with a blunt object in the kitchen next to the entrance to the garage, which would explain why those tiny specks of blood were found there. This likely would have taken place while the couple's children were asleep, giving Cal plenty of time to clean up the evidence, dispose of Michele's body and the murder weapon, plant her minivan on Hagedorn Hill Road next to the driveway, and then wake up the following morning to quote-unquote discover that Michele was missing. If that's what happened, Cal did an incredibly thorough job of covering his tracks, because other than those specks of blood, there was no evidence that a crime had even taken place. Cal owned a 252-acre estate which included a lake, so he would have had plenty of places to hide Michele's body, though it has been extensively searched by police over the years, and they've never found anything. However, the fact that Cal was so cooperative about letting police search his house and property, and even gave them permission to do so while he was not there, seemed to indicate that he either had nothing to hide, or he disposed of Michele at another location, and knew they wouldn't find anything at his estate. But while the actual physical evidence that Cal committed a crime was not there, his behavior that morning was certainly suspicious enough to raise red flags. If Cal was guilty, then it seems pretty calculating that he would call up the family's nanny, Barb Thayer, to drive to the house to help the children get ready for school once he noticed Michele wasn't there. That way, Barb would be the one to discover Michele's minivan at the end of the driveway, and Cal could claim ignorance. I won't give Cal too much flack for not acting overly concerned about the fact that Michele was missing because different people react to different things in different ways. After all, the couple were going through a heated divorce at the time, so I wouldn't blame Cal for not getting overly emotional. But according to Barb, Cal's initial reaction to finding the minivan was to assume that Michele left it there and hitched a ride to New York City. And the only appropriate response to that is, "Are you kidding me?" Under normal circumstances, it would make no sense for someone with their own vehicle to just abandon it on a rural road at the end of their driveway and then hitch a ride to another city over 200 miles away without telling anyone. But this was September the 12th, 2001, one day removed from one of the biggest tragedies the United States had ever experienced, and New York City was in a state of chaos, so there's no way anyone would be traveling there unless they really had to. Yes, Michele had apparently been planning to go to the city on the 13th or 14th, but a mother of 4 is not just going to leave her children behind to hitch a ride to a location which had just been hit with a terrorist attack, especially when she had an appointment scheduled with her divorce attorney later that afternoon. It's totally inexplicable that this would be Cal's initial reaction to Michele not returning home. I know Michele had said she was planning to visit a former classmate of hers in New York, though Cal claimed that she was actually taking a trip there to pawn off a Rolex and diamond engagement ring. If you watch the Crime Watch Daily segment on this case, you'll see Cal put heavy emphasis on the fact that Michele's purse and a velvet bag she used to carry her jewelry was never found, so perhaps he was attempting to plant the seed that robbery was a possible motive for her murder. It's not implausible that Michele was planning to pawn her jewelry around that time period, since she was hoping to make a down payment on a new house and apparently had a lot of credit card debt. But I don't see why she couldn't do this at a local pawn shop rather than traveling to New York City. One thing's for certain is that I highly doubt anyone would be making a special trip there to pawn jewelry on the day after 9/11. There's also been a lot of dispute over the allegations that Cal never even made one attempt to call Michele's cell phone when he noticed she was missing. According to many people, Cal was such a jealous, controlling spouse that he would constantly phone Michele's cell if she ever stayed out late, yet he didn't bother to do so on the one day she didn't come home. During Cal's final 2 trials, his defense team placed a lot of emphasis on a phone call which was made to Michele's cell phone from the Harris residence that morning. Even though Barb Thayer claimed she was the one who made the call, the defense tried to say it was Cal, but even if that's true, I really don't see how it proves anything. Like I just mentioned, Cal's initial assumption was that Michele hitched a ride to New York City without telling anyone, even though she was supposed to help get the children ready for school. Yet he only attempts to call her cell phone once and doesn't even bother to leave a voicemail? To be honest, a lot of these details I've just mentioned, along with Cal's insistence on washing his truck and Michele's minivan at his dealership immediately after Michele went missing, are a lot more troubling to me than the specks of blood found inside the house. But it's still very circumstantial evidence and does not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Cal committed murder. We know that Cal definitely had a motive, as he did not react well to Michele's decision to file for divorce, and the couple were having trouble agreeing to a final settlement. But since these issues had been ongoing for 8 months, and it was obvious that there was no chance of salvaging the marriage, what could have been the breaking point which compelled Cal to kill Michele on this particular night? Well, we know that Michele had an appointment with her divorce attorney the following day, and both sides were going to court for a divorce trial in October, and just a few weeks earlier, Michele had filed paperwork seeking an appraisal on the Harris family's car dealerships. It's unclear when exactly Cal found out about this, but since he would be responsible for the $30,000 appraisal fee, I'm sure he would have been absolutely livid. If Cal found out on September the 11th, this very well could have caused him to go into a fit of rage and kill Michele when she returned home that night. However, if this wasn't a crime of passion, it was instead a planned, premeditated murder, there may be a twisted reason why Cal chose to do it on the evening of September the 11th. The New York State Police flat out admitted that they did not have adequate resources to perform a full-scale search for Michele during the early stages of the investigation, since they sent hundreds of troopers to New York City to deal with the aftermath of 9/11. For all we know, Cal may have been planning to kill Michele for quite some time, but once he learned that New York's law enforcement community was in a state of chaos following a terrorist attack, he may have realized this would be the perfect time to do it. Obviously, investigating Michele's disappearance was not going to be law enforcement's top priority at that point, so Cal would have had plenty of time and opportunity to cover his tracks. If this is how things played out, then that demonstrates what a truly diabolical mind Cal has. What kind of person looks at the tragic events of 9/11 and decides, hey, today would be a convenient opportunity to get away with the perfect murder? Now, I know I've been painting a pretty unflattering picture of Cal, but I can't deny the fact that there are a number of other potential suspects in this case, so we have to explore all the different possibilities. We know that Michele had been carrying on a nearly year-long affair with a younger man, Brian Early, and they started seeing each other months before she officially filed for divorce. Brian was the last known person to see Michele alive, and his fingerprints were found on the minivan's driver's side door. By the sound of things, Brian seemed to be a lot more committed to the relationship than Michele was. He had a career as a land surveyor in Philadelphia, but decided to relocate to Tioga County just to be closer to Michele, and he was willing to use a good chunk of his own money to help pay for a down payment on Michele's new house. Brian was also hoping to marry Michele immediately after her divorce was finalized, but it doesn't sound like she was willing to get remarried that quickly. There's also the fact that Michele secretly conducted a brief affair with one of her co-workers, Michael Casper, while she was seeing Brian, so there's some question about how committed she really was to the relationship. Theoretically, when Michele showed up at Brian's apartment on the evening of September 11th, she could have told Brian that she wasn't ready to settle down with him, and this caused him to snap and kill her. But there's no evidence at all to support this scenario. By all accounts, Brian was nothing but cooperative with investigators, and they found no reason to consider him a suspect. I believe Brian mentioned leaning in through the driver's side window to kiss Michele before police even mentioned his fingerprints being found on the door, so it doesn't sound like he was fabricating a story to explain why they were there. The main reason it's hard to believe that Brian could have been responsible is that it makes no sense for him to drive Michele's minivan to her property and abandon it on the road next to her driveway. Not only would Brian be running a huge risk of being seen, but the Harris residence was a 20-minute drive from Brian's apartment. Unless Brian had some unknown accomplice who accompanied him to the location in a separate vehicle to give him a ride, how would Brian have traveled back home after he abandoned the minivan? Of course, while it was tempting for Cal and his supporters to point the finger at Brian during the early stages of the investigation, they've since placed all their emphasis on the eyewitness sighting of Michele arguing with a man outside a pickup truck. Since Brian did not own a pickup truck at that time, it doesn't sound like anyone considers him a viable suspect anymore. Now, before Michele went to Brian's apartment following her shift at Lefty's, she had drinks with two of her co-workers, Michael Casper and Michael Hakes. Like I mentioned earlier, Michele had a secret 2-month affair with Casper earlier that year. By his own admission, Casper was not a saint, as he was suffering from financial problems and a cocaine addiction at that time, often sold illegal drugs for his friends, and had been arrested for an incident where he assaulted his girlfriend the previous year. But he always maintained that he and Michele made a mutual decision to end their affair, and there was no resentment over it. As for Michael Hakes, there probably wouldn't have been much reason to suspect him at all, if not for the fact that he previously served 10 years in prison for rape, which Michele and her co-workers were apparently not aware of at that time. From what I gathered, Casper did not have an airtight alibi that night, but Hakes' girlfriend told investigators that he arrived at her apartment a short time after he parted ways with Michele, and she verified him being there all night. But there also isn't much reason to suspect that Casper had any involvement with Michele's disappearance, as their affair had been over for 3 months, and there were no signs that he was angry about it, and would have had a motive to commit murder. And let's not forget it was verified that Michele drove to Brian's apartment when she parted ways with Casper, and was there until between 11 and 11:30 p.m. So if Casper was involved, he would have had to follow Michele from Lefty's and wait outside Brian's apartment for nearly 2 hours, even though for all he knew, she could have decided to spend the entire night there. After Michele left the apartment, Casper would have had to kill her at another location, dispose of her body, and abandon her minivan next to her property, but there's no evidence to suggest he did this. Like Brian Early and Michael Hakes, it sounds like Casper was nothing but cooperative with the investigation, passed a polygraph, and he was pretty much ruled out as a suspect. It is a pretty crazy situation that 3 of the last people to see a missing person alive were 2 men the victim had been having separate affairs with and a convicted rapist. Under normal circumstances, this might set off many alarm bells, but in this particular case, I think these 3 men are nothing more than red herrings and have no relevance to Michele's disappearance. So now we're going to focus on the 2 alternate suspects whom Cal and his supporters believe were the real perpetrators of this crime, Stacey Stewart and Christopher Thomason. But first, we should talk about what is easily the most controversial aspect of this story, the eyewitness testimony of Kevin Tubbs. Quite frankly, Tubbs' testimony is pretty much the crux of this entire case, and if he hadn't come forward, Cal Harris would probably still be in prison and we wouldn't be talking about this today. Without Tubbs, it would be so easy to believe the prosecution scenario that Cal murdered Michele and disposed of her body when she arrived home that night, but if Tubbs is telling the truth, and he really did see Michele arguing with a man in her driveway at 5:30 a.m. on the morning of September 12th, then this completely throws everything for a loop. However, given that he waited nearly 6 years to come forward with this information, there is definitely good reason to be skeptical of Tubbs' story. I mean, the way Tubbs tells it, a light bulb went off over his head when he saw a newspaper article about Cal Harris being convicted of his wife's murder, but Michele's disappearance was a pretty huge story in Tioga County, so I seriously doubt that Tubbs could have been unaware of it before the trial concluded. According to Tubbs, he did not put 2 and 2 together until he learned the exact timeline of Michele's disappearance while reading the coverage of Cal's trial. When he saw that Cal had been found guilty, Tubbs became concerned that the wrong man may have been convicted. Of course, given the amount of time that passed, the district attorney's office questioned the reliability of Tubbs' account and wondered if he might have gotten the date wrong, but in Tubbs' defense, his sighting took place following 9/11, one of the most infamous dates in American history, so he may have still had a vivid memory of the events following that day. I can tell you that even after 18 years, I can still vividly remember where I was and what I was doing on 9/11. All that being said, a lot of people cannot overlook the timing of Tubbs coming forward immediately after Cal was found guilty. Since Cal hailed from a very wealthy and influential family, there has always been gossip that they could have bribed Tubbs to provide a false eyewitness account, which tore apart the prosecution's case and exonerated Cal. Now, there's never been any evidence to support these claims, so I have no idea if they're true or not, but the trial judge did find Tubbs' story to be credible enough to overturn Cal's conviction. Well, even if you believe Tubbs' account to be accurate, this still brings up a lot of unanswered questions. Let's assume that the unidentified man with a dark Chevrolet pickup truck is responsible for Michele's disappearance. This implies that he followed Michele back to her residence, prompting her to park her minivan at the side of Hagedorn Hill Road and confront him in the driveway. Things then escalated to the point where this man abducted Michele in his truck, killed her, and disposed of her body at another location. It's not an implausible theory, and would provide an explanation for why Michele's minivan was found in that unusual spot. At the time, Cal did own a truck, but I do not believe it was a dark Chevy pickup truck. And Tubbs also described the man he saw as being in his mid-20s, and was positive it was not Cal Harris. I know it still would have been dark outside when Tubbs saw this man, but Cal was a distinct-looking 40-year-old bald guy, so I don't think Tubbs would have mistaken him for a man in his mid-20s. However, the one thing about Tubbs' story which has never been explained is the timeline. He claims he saw Michele arguing with the man at 5:30 a.m., but the last confirmed sighting of Michele is when she left Brian Early's apartment sometime between 11 and 11:30 p.m. the previous night. It would have only taken Michele around 20 minutes to drive home from there, so this leaves a window of 6 hours, in which Michele's whereabouts are unaccounted for. For Tubbs' story to make sense, Michele would have had to travel to another location after she left Brian's apartment, and no evidence has ever been found to suggest she was planning on doing that. Of course, Cal's defense team have always believed that the most likely candidate to be the mysterious man in the driveway was Stacy Stewart. Stewart was 25 years old and owned a dark pickup truck at that time. He lived on a property located only 7 miles away, and he had a connection to Michele since he was a regular patron at Lefty's. Not only that, but Stewart abandoned his new house and moved back home to Texas only months after Michele went missing, and fragments of women's clothing were found in a burn pit on Stewart's former property years later. So theoretically, since Michele and Stewart were acquainted, perhaps she traveled to see him after leaving Brian's apartment. When Michele attempted to drive back home early the next morning, Stewart followed her, and this accounts for the argument Tubbs claimed he saw at 5:30. Stewart subsequently murdered Michele, prompting his decision to leave the area and move back to Texas shortly thereafter. On the surface, Stewart does not seem like a bad suspect. He actually agreed to do an interview on the aforementioned episode of Crime Watch Daily, admitted that he did know Michele from his time frequenting Lefty's, but claimed they never had any real social relationship, and at no point was he ever alone with her. Given that Michele conducted a secret affair with Michael Casper that not even her closest friends knew about, it's certainly possible she could have had one with Stewart as well. But there's never been any evidence to support this, and police did look into Stewart as a possible suspect during the early stages of the investigation and pretty much cleared him. Of course, Cal claims this was only because the police had tunnel vision and the lead investigator had a personal grudge against him since he once fired her father from one of his dealerships. As a result, evidence which pointed to other potential suspects was ignored. In addition to Stewart, Cal's defense team also pointed the finger at his friend, Christopher Thomason, another steel worker who frequented Lefty's and returned back home to Texas following Michele's disappearance. In the months prior to Cal's fourth trial, they organized an excavation of a burn pit on Stewart's former property and turned up what appeared to be fragments of women's clothing, though they can never be conclusively linked to Michele. The rest of the evidence against Stewart and Thomason is nothing more than hearsay, as a couple of eyewitnesses have testified about incriminating statements which both men allegedly made. I know Thomason's former girlfriend recounted an incident where he showed up at Stewart's house in Tioga County and asked him to burn some bloody clothing he was wearing, so I must admit that my eyebrows raised a bit when Stewart confirmed this story was true during his interview on Crime Watch Daily. Stewart denied the claims that this incident took place on the day following Michele's disappearance, but he says the incident did happen, and there's something a little off about the whole story. The way Stewart tells it, Thomason and his girlfriend at the time just showed up at his door one day wearing bloody clothing, and then he had them burned in the property's burn pit and a burn barrel he owned. Stewart says he remarked to Thomason, "Did you kill a deer? Have you been hunting or something?" But Thomason did not really answer or provide a full explanation for where the blood came from. Okay, so if a friend of yours suddenly showed up at your house asking you to burn their bloody clothing without any explanation, would that not raise any red flags with you? Does this story imply that perhaps Thomason was responsible for Michele's disappearance and Stewart had no involvement? There also don't seem to be any details out there about this girlfriend of Thomason's who was supposedly wearing bloody clothing alongside him, so how would she fit into this? But if Stewart's story is true, then this does provide an alternate explanation for the presence of the women's clothing fragments found in the burn pit in 2016. But the fact of the matter is that Stewart moved away from that property 14 years before this evidence was found, so it may have no relevance to this case at all. I don't know, if there were no other leads to work with, I might be inclined to think that Stewart and Thomason were promising suspects, but since there's always been such a large cloud of suspicion surrounding Cal Harris, I believe that the whole lead with Stewart and Thomason is probably nothing more than smoke and mirrors concocted by Cal's defense team in order to pull the focus away from him. No matter how many fingers you point at alternate suspects, or how hard you attempt to concoct a scenario where Michele was murdered outside her home, that still doesn't change the fact that specks of blood containing her DNA were found inside her kitchen and garage. Sure, there wasn't a large enough quantity of blood to conclusively prove that foul play had taken place, but the blood which was found does seem to suggest that an act of violence took place there. Really, which scenario sounds more plausible to you? Michele returns home and is attacked by her estranged, hot-tempered husband after being engaged in a heated divorce battle for 8 months, or Michele inexplicably decides to stay out all night, and after 6 hours in which her whereabouts are unaccounted for, she gets into an argument with a man in her driveway at 5:30 in the morning before she is abducted and murdered. I personally believe the first scenario is more believable, and were it not for the eyewitness testimony of Kevin Tubbs, I don't think there would be any question about it. I have no idea if Tubbs is telling the truth, intentionally lying, or just plain mistaken about what he saw, but I don't think his story completely negates the suspicious behavior displayed by Cal in the weeks following Michele's disappearance. Remember, not only did he try to say that Michele hitched a ride to New York City, but he immediately attempted to sell off her personal items, brought a former girlfriend to his house less than 3 weeks later, and gave off the impression that he knew Michele was never coming back. So yes, I still believe that the simplest explanation in this case is the correct one. The husband did it. Cal had the motive, means, and opportunity, and he would have had more than enough time to dispose of Michele's body and clean up the evidence before anyone noticed she was missing. We have numerous accounts of Cal flying into a rage and displaying threatening behavior towards Michele before she went missing, and his temper has even landed him in legal hot water after his acquittal. It's just so easy to picture him flying off the handle and killing someone. This is very similar to the episode I released last year about the disappearance of Patty Vaughn. A woman decided to break free from her controlling husband by getting a divorce from him, but he was narcissistic enough to believe that she would eventually change her mind and come crawling back to him. Once it became apparent that this wasn't going to happen, and that a divorce could also hurt him financially, the husband decided to get rid of her. Now, what's ironic is that I believe there's a lot more damning evidence against Patty Vaughn's husband than there is against Cal Harris, yet Cal is the one who's gone on trial and been convicted of murder on multiple occasions. But as much as I hate to say this, if I was on the jury at one of Cal's trials, I probably would have had a hard time convicting him. In order to find someone guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, you have to go by the evidence, not personal feelings or gut instincts. And as much as I believe that Cal is a scumbag who probably killed his wife, there really isn't much actual evidence that he committed this crime. Again, after 15 years and 4 separate trials, the decision to acquit was ultimately made by a judge, not a jury, so as unfair as this whole situation might be to Michele's family, you can't really question the verdict. So technically, I guess the justice system did exactly what it was supposed to do, even though it meant a potentially guilty man walked free. Of course, no matter what new evidence might surface, Cal can never be tried for this crime again, but since Michele's body has never been found, this case is still technically an unsolved mystery. Even if Michele's family never gets to receive full justice, they at least deserve to recover her remains and give her a proper burial, and until that happens, this case should not be considered closed. So if you happen to have any information on the disappearance of Michele Harris, please contact the New York State Police Department at 607-687-3961. That's 607-687-3961. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, we released a new episode about the Frederick and Cedric Young case. As you might recall, this was featured as a final appeal segment on Unsolved Mysteries, and is the crazy story of one twin brother potentially being sent to prison for a crime his sibling committed. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also released another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. To learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. And before we bring this episode to a close, I'd like to take a moment to thank our many listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon these past few weeks. They include The Mugshot Podcast, Sam K., Kristen H., Caitlin S., Janelle A., Kristen M., Dana M., Brenda L., Andy W., Nikki C., Sue K., Crystal J., Jeff and Lee H., Jamie S.Y., Jane D., Jamie S., Jamie C., Joseph Y., Linda I., James W., Seth M., Togi T., Michael L., Mary Beth L., Allison T., Elizabeth M., K., Ann P., Alyssa W., Ashley G., and last but not least, the Resolved Mysteries podcast. They're actually a podcast hosted by a group of ladies who explore every single episode of Unsolved Mysteries in chronological order, so if you're a fan of the show, I definitely recommend you check it out. Also, I'd like to play a promo for another major true crime podcast I recommend from one of my best podcasting friends, Charlie, and that's Crime Lines. Have a listen.
Hey there, Charlie here. You might recognize my voice from the true crime show Insight, R.I.P. I've rebranded the show as a solo show now, and it's called Crime Lines. I will walk you through the events of the crime, any trial that occurred, and the aftermath. Recent Crime Lines episodes include the Jack family, missing 30 years from British Columbia; Abraham Shakespeare, a man who won the Florida lottery and lost his life; and Janet Moses, a young woman who died in a Makatu lifting ceremony in New Zealand. And if you miss Insight, don't worry. The old episodes are still available on the Crime Lines feed, ready for you to binge. So go subscribe to Crime Lines on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit, as well as the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum. Need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week, and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.